All right, so here we are. We're going to review the corrido for the next 30, 40 minutes or so. So if you have any questions, feel free to speak up in the chat or out loud or whatever. So let's see. Let's go over this definition, which you should already have. It's a narrative ballad, and the theme of these songs have to do with current or past events that happen in the United States or Mexico. And this is a method of transmitting oral history. So like as we learned in the readings and also in the PowerPoints and in the short documentaries that I posted, is that the big reason why corrido was popular in the early 1900s is because the dictator of Mexico, as we already learned about, didn't invest enough money in the education of Mexicans, and there was a very, very high illiteracy rate. In other words, a lot of people did not know how to read. So in order to gain news and the current events of that time period, they had to listen through it in some way. They couldn't read it on newspaper, but they had to listen or absorb it through song, which is why the corrido becomes very popular. So that being said, let's look at these study questions. If the corrido told the story of Mexican history 100 years ago during the revolution, do you think it still tells us the history in present day? And do you believe the corrido fuels narco culture in Mexico? That's the other one, and which some of you already answered in the discussion post. So let's talk about the first one. Do you believe, maybe you can write it in the chat or volunteer out loud, do you believe that the corrido is still a method of transmitting history or oral history in present day? What do y'all think about that? Yes or no, and why? And again, there's no wrong answer. Angel says yes. Why do you say yes, Angel? Why do you believe that's true? Lucio also says yes. Lucio, why do you believe that's true? So a lot of people are saying yes. Why is that true? Anybody, come on. There's no wrong answer. Yes.
Professor Harris, so I would say yes to that because I feel that the music or the corridos that were back then are still being heard of today. So it does talk about the history from then to now.
All right. So here's right. What about, is it telling the history of present day, like whatever is going on today? That's really what I'm asking. Oh. So the corrido of 1910, you're right, did tell the stories of what was happening in 1910, but does the corrido nowadays, in 100 years later, tell the story of present day Mexico? That's the real question. Anybody want to answer that? What do y'all think? I mean, some of you said yes. Angel, Lucio, Monica said yes. Why is that? I mean, it's a very easy answer, because let's talk about present day, nowadays, 2021, 2020, 2021. What are a lot of corridos about? Maybe you listen to this style of music, maybe you don't. Doesn't really matter to me. I just want to know, maybe you might have an idea about what the corrido is about in present day. So what is it about? Anybody have any clues on that? What are people singing about nowadays?
Their life.
Rancho humilde. What do you mean by that, Lucio? Explain to everybody what that means. A big record label? No, I know what that means, but like, are you answering my question? What is the corrido singing about today? What are people singing about? They are singing about Rancho Humilde, and that is a big record label. But for example, here's another question. What is that? What, that record label has a ton of artists, and what are they singing about? Drugs, people making corridos still today because it's a way of telling the history in present day. It talks about the narco life. Sort of. Here's what I argue. You're sort of right, Angel. Let's see. Lucio says very popular among the youth, which sing about drugs and premarital intercourse. Okay. Yeah, you're right. So if you all remember the 90s, maybe you weren't alive then, or the 80s with the rap. Rap was talking about the streets, things you do on the streets, drugs or premarital sex or whatever Lucio says, or whatever issues, even like selling from the back of your car or whatever, drugs or whatever, right? Whatever the issues were going on back then, people were rapping about that, right? So because of that, rap becomes super popular because people relate to rap, because people are listening to rap and saying, hey, that's what I go through on an everyday basis. I don't know if you ever seen interviews with, do y'all know or remember of Notorious B.I.G., Biggie Smalls, right? You guys remember him? One of the great rappers here in American history. Him, East Coast rapper. And on the West Coast, you have like Tupac, you have Snoop and Dre and a whole bunch of other people that came after that. But Notorious B.I.G. or Biggie or however you want to call him, Christopher, whatever you want to call him, after he passed away, after he was killed, right? They asked his mama, what do you think about his music? And I don't know if you remember her answer. She was like, well, I guess it's okay. It's nice, but I didn't know he was going through all of that, because he was talking about selling. He was talking about navigating his way through the streets on the East Coast, right? Brooklyn and NYC, New York City. So that's what he was talking about. And she had no idea. She thought that he was getting up in the morning, going to school, and then coming back home. She didn't realize all the things that happened at school, the things that happened on the way to school, and the things that happened after school on his way home. So she was kind of blown away by the issues that he was talking about. Some parents don't realize the issues that their kids are going through. So that's exactly what Lucio said. Rancho Humilde is a big record label based out of I think LA, some part of LA, and they have a lot of young artists that sing a lot of things about youth, not youth, but maybe issues that youth will sort of like relate to, like maybe like sex, for example, or drug use. So I think somebody said before, Jasmine said before, drugs, and some of you were all saying like narco stuff, like Angel mentioned narco stuff. Well, in the 80s and in the 90s, corridos were singing about narcos, and even in the early 2000s, when you guys were in diapers still, corridos were singing about narcos and this narc here, that narc there, and this narc and that cartel, X, Y, and Z. And then we kind of got over that phase. And nowadays, people are sort of like, I think it's even more gangster rap than it was before. Corridos have always been linked to gangster rap. Like the American version of corridos is gangster rap. And I could always see that, but in present day, I think it's more gangster rap than it's ever been, because gangster rap talks about the issues of the streets, and corridos do as well. So what's the big issue right now? Since 2012, 13, 14, we started talking about the legalization of certain types of drugs, like marijuana, for example, and it happened in certain states like Colorado and a whole bunch of other states in the United States. And it finally happened in California. And now we have dispensaries, and you can't go to jail for smoking in your home or whatever. But whereas before you could. So now recreational drug use is sort of something that's normalized, something that we see very, very often. In fact, when I was in high school, there weren't a lot of people that were doing marijuana, for example, weed. I think out of 10 kids, maybe you have like one or two that were doing weed. And we call those people potheads. Not that there's anything good or bad about that, but they were the people that were doing drugs. Nowadays, it's like opposite. There's like one or two people out of 10 kids that haven't tried it, right? So marijuana and drug use has become extremely normalized, and it's almost become like a normal thing. If you're like 18, 25, 30 years old and you haven't tried that drug yet, then there's something, very wrong with you according to mainstream society, because we don't even consider it a drug anymore. Maybe meth is a drug because it's made with like chemicals and stuff like that. Maybe that is a drug. Maybe this is a drug, but a lot of people say weed is not really or should not really be a drug because it's a plant, something you can grow in the backyard. Just add water and it'll sprout, and you roll it up, and it's something that you use to like kill your pain, something you use to feel good, whatever the reason is, and it's become normalized, right? Because of that reason, people are singing about it in the streets, and they're not talking about the narco lifestyle. They're talking about hanging out, kicking back, lighting up, etc. So it's yes, the themes are the same. Drugs is the very same, but the way in which they're talking about drugs is very, very different, right? So let's talk about, we're gonna stay on this slide for a long time. When was corrido popular? I need you to know these 4 times that corridos are popular. Because of the 1910 Mexican Revolution, we already know all the history about that and why it was popular. High literacy rate, etc. People need to, corridos were the TMZ of 1910. We need to know our news, and there was no television, and we could not read the newspaper. So corridos were it. Sometimes there's different versions of corridos because if a corrido is written in northern Mexico and it takes a couple of years for it to travel to the southern part of Mexico, based on people retelling the story, sometimes you get a verse added or sometimes a verse gets cut. So you could listen to a corrido by artist A and the same corrido by artist B, and sometimes the lyrics are different or the verses are different, right? Let's fast forward to the 1970s. In the 1970s, we have like the war against drugs, and even in the late 70s and early 80s, we had the war on drugs as well. But in the 1970s, a lot of the drugs that were coming in from the United States, coming into the United States, were coming in from Colombia. And if you've ever seen Narcos on Netflix, they talk about this issue, right? The drugs, especially cocaine, was coming in from Colombia, and it was hitting the East Coast of the United States, right? It was all up and down the East Coast. And then the United States sort of puts a stop to that, and they want to stop and they want to have this embargo where we cannot and we should not, allow so many goods to be coming in from Colombia and Miami into Miami, for example, because a lot of that is drugs and it's ruining our culture and our kids and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what ended up happening if you watch Narcos or Narcos Mexico is that instead of drugs coming from Colombia to the United States, all of a sudden they were starting to come from Mexico. The drugs started happening from Mexico, and Mexicans were buying Colombian drugs and transferring it to the United States. Mexicans were doing all the hard work. They got smart and they decided to cut the Colombians out and started making their own drugs and transferring it up north, right? And when that started happening, we had a whole bunch of movies that were made in the 1980s, 1970s, for example, that featured drug trades. We had like Camelia La Tejana, we had Banda del Carro Rojo, we had a ton of films. I remember turning on the television in the 90s and you would see all these films, and my mom like would never let me watch it, but my dad would always let me watch it. And we'd watch people like killing themselves or killing each other with like a AK, whatever, they were dumb movies. And who were the stars of those movies? A band called Los Tigres del Norte. They were up and coming, actually from San Jose, California, but also from Sinaloa, Mexico. And they were like right place, right time. They started recording these songs because that's what people were talking about in Mexico, right? Los Tigres have always been a band that talks about the issues. When women were dying in high numbers due to femicide in Juarez in the early 1990s, who was the band that sang about them? Los Tigres del Norte did. When the issue of like same-sex marriages and sexuality and LGBTQ, etc., issues started coming about, what band sings about it? None of them except for Tigres del Norte. So they've always been a band that reacts to what's happening in culture and they spit it out in their music. And so Los Tigres del Norte in the 1970s started recording all these songs coming out of movies, and narco corridos in general take a spike, and they sort of die down. In the 1990s, you have three specific events that happened in the 1990s. You have Chalino Sanchez. Anybody ever heard of Chalino Sanchez? Anybody know of him or who he is? I hope. I think you have, maybe, I hope. Lucio sent, what is that? I don't even know what that is. Let me download it. Modern Corridos. I'm telling you, I'm on a new computer today, so I don't even know where that downloaded to. I don't even see it. I'll click on it in a little bit again. So Chalino Sanchez, I've heard of him. Chalino Sanchez was a corrido singer in the early 90s. He was in the United States. Let me tell you a very quick story about him. He's from Sinaloa. His sister was raped, and he avenged his sister's being raped, and he killed the person that raped his sister, because in Mexico back then and even nowadays, there's no justice. In fact, like over 99%, 90%, almost 99% of the homicides, of the murders that happen in Mexico, they go unsolved, right? And we're not going to get into those reasons, but they do go unsolved. And so he took it in his own hands to avenge the rape of his sister, and he killed this guy. But that also means that he had to flee Mexico. He came into the United States, started writing songs. People started recording songs. Long story short, he didn't really like the way people were recording his songs, so he started singing himself, and he started like making noise in the music industry, selling his cassettes and all that in swap meets. And then in 1992, early 1992, he has a concert down by Coachella, down south where they have the big Coachella festival, right? So he was at a concert out there at a nightclub, Los Arcos nightclub, and nobody really knows the exact story unless you're there, because nobody really talks about it. But somebody pulls out a gun and decides to shoot Chalino, and he pulls out his own gun and decides to decided to protect himself. And you have this sort of like gunfight that happened on stage. Anyway, Chalino ends up soaring to popularity because of that gunfight. Imagine, why do you think we like 50 Cent? He sings good, but he's also real because he got shot like 7 times, right? Whereas a lot of people talk bad about Drake or Bieber, who tried to rap. You remember when Bieber was trying to rap and we're like, he's not real. Like he's rich and he's Canadian or whatever. Drake, and Bieber is this or that. Like, they're not real, like Biggie, like Tupac, like Snoop, like anybody else, right? Like 50 Cent, for example. So Chalino gets in a fight, and a gunfight, which are the things that he sings about anyways. So his status is elevated all the way to the top. This was like January or February of 1992. A couple months later, he's selling out shows everywhere, all over the United States, not in Mexico, because again, he killed that one person in Mexico. So you have an entire family of people that hate him. So he's not going to go to Mexico. But he did make that mistake of going to Mexico. I think it was like May, can't remember the month, of 1992. So several months after he got shot, he decides to go do a concert in Mexico. And right after the show, he's killed. What happens to his legacy? It skyrockets, and his popularity skyrockets. So people dub him the king of corridos. People start listening to corridos because of him. You get a whole bunch of copycats that came out after him, like maybe Las de la Sierra or El Chalinillo. You have a whole bunch of people that started copying his voice all the way through the 1990s, and people loved it. And corridos are at an all-time high again. It spikes. 1910 corridos are popular, they dip down. 1970s again, they dip down. In the 90s, they're popular again. And another reason, so reason number 2, corridos are popular in the 1990s is because there's a signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement. North American Free Trade Agreement, also called NAFTA, which you see in Corrido PowerPoint, I think number 2, is free trade between the US, Mexico, and Canada. So that means things can move along at a faster rate. There's a lot more trade, including drugs. It wasn't supposed to include drugs, but hey, if I can ship tomatoes and corn at a faster, easier rate, then why can't I ship drugs too, right? So people start trafficking drugs. In other words, NAFTA made it easy for drug traffickers to traffic drugs, easier than it was before NAFTA was signed. So now you have a whole bunch of drugs coming into the United States, right? They've said in the last 30, 40 years, 90% of the drugs that we consume in the United States come from Mexico, whereas 90% of the guns that are found and used in Mexico come from the United States. And this is all during the time when drugs are illegal in the United States. So we get them from Mexico. Guns are illegal in Mexico and still are, and they get them from the United States. So we're basically trading guns for drugs. Let me ask you a question about this whole like weed that I asked my other classes as well. Do you guys believe weed is a violent drug? It's kind of a trick question. Kind of like there's like a deeply involved answer. Anybody? Yes, a drug is a drug, right? Anybody else have any other answers? People that do that type of drug, for example, will might say, ah, it's not a violent drug. Like how many people go out and do crazy things when they're on weed, right? Because what does weed usually make you do? Get the munchies or whatever. See, Sean says it's not a violent drug. And a lot of people use that just if it just gets you fat. It gives you the munchies, right? If you don't have a good metabolism, there goes your lean body. So a lot of people have this sort of justification about smoking weed. Hey, it's natural, one, and two, it's not a violent drug. You see like meth heads breaking into cars and houses and committing crimes. You see people on crack, committing murder. You see all this stuff happening, but people on weed, they just want to sit back and smoke and munch on some Cheetos and take a nap, right? So there's this stigma about it that it's non-violent, but it is a violent drug, and not for the reasons that you think, but for other reasons. Because how many people have died in Mexico trying to traffic that weed to us? And so we have to think about that. I heard this survey a couple years ago where somebody says, hey, you wake up on Monday morning, here's the thing, you have two options. One, there's a massive earthquake in Indonesia, and like 250,000, a quarter of a million people in that area die because of tsunamis. So that happens and you go about your day. Or those people are saved, that doesn't happen, but we take your pinky off. Which one would you prefer? Right? So they did this survey, and most of the people were like, I like my pinky. I could care less about, not that I could care less, but I care about my pinky. And yeah, like I don't know anybody in Indonesia, and yeah, it's a lot of deaths and all that, but I mean, I like my pinky, right? In other words, we don't care about what happens to other people. We're only concerned with ourselves. So let's go back to this drug thing. Since the early 2000s, some people say there's an estimated like 200 or 300,000 deaths, homicides that are related to drug trade, to the drug trade and drug trafficking. And what was the one of the biggest drugs that they were trafficking out of Mexico into the United States? It was weed. It was marijuana. So yeah, you can say it's non-violent because you don't do anything violent with the drug. But people in another country down south are dying, and you can say, well, yeah, the narcs are killing each other. What does that matter? Most of the people that are dying are not the narcs. The 200 or 300,000 deaths that have happened as a result is mostly people who have been just caught in the crossfire, right? Why do you think people want to leave Mexico and come into the United States, right? I had a friend who went to get married in Juarez. He found someone in Mexico, wanted to marry her, can't bring her over here. They have to get married out there, then prove that they're married, and then bring her here. Got to do it the right way. Según. So he goes to Juarez, Ciudad Juarez, to get married. On his way to the court, there's a guy walking like 10 feet in front of him. Somebody just walks right behind him and puts a bullet in the back of his head. And the whole town just like turns around and it's like, oh, okay, people just walking over the body like nothing. And it freaked him out. And he told me, yeah, people are so like not affected by all that violence out there. We're not used to that here, but they are used to it out there. And it's so sad because kids don't even care. They see somebody get shot in the face, they don't even. I see that all the time. It's like the second time I've seen it this week. It's not a big deal anymore. And that's really sad. Why? Because we like to consume our drugs here in the United States. So yeah, maybe you're right, Sean. It's not violent because you don't do violent things about it. But just like we like our pinky, like we don't really care what happens in other countries. So let them kill themselves as long as we get our drugs. Maybe it was a good thing that it was legalized here in California. I always thought if it's legalized here in these like the major states like California, for example, then maybe drug violence might decrease in Mexico, right? But then also like I was torn when I was like trying to vote on that thing. Like, yeah, I think it will help Mexico if we legalize weed here. Maybe people won't be killing themselves to like bring it to us. But then also like, how am I supposed to look my kid in my face and be like, yeah, I voted for like weed to become a legal drug here in California? What if he becomes an addict or whatever, And also they say weed is a gateway drug. Anybody who's done meth or cocaine or anything like that, they always started with weed. So it's like, what are we supposed to do as people or as parents, right? So that's the 1990s. The third thing about the 90s that gets corridos popping is like the big wave of the internet that hit sort of like in the mid 90s. People could now email files, people could now upload websites and stuff. We weren't doing YouTube yet, but it kind of sort of helps, like, with media sharing. The MP3 comes about. Napster, I don't know if you remember Napster, but you download illegal songs all day long from like random places in Mexico or whatever. You're just downloading on your computer. Sometimes it might be a virus, but most of the time it's a song. And then what they call sharing and file streaming and file sharing and all that, which was all illegal. Now it's like a normal thing. You pay your $5 subscription as a student, you get all the songs you want. But back then you had to illegally download them, right? That's why corridos became popular in the 1990s. Chalino, his death, his legacy, NAFTA, and the greater trafficking of drugs, and also internet, including MP3s and Napster and all that stuff. You probably don't know what Napster is, but that was like, you get on this website, you search for any song you want, and if it's there, you just download it. My computer in college was downloading songs. Like I would wake up before I go to class, I'd download like 100 songs. It would take a while, like maybe 10 minutes a song, because the internet wasn't fast back then, right? But I download 100 songs. When I come back from class, most of them are downloaded. I'll pick another 20, 30. Dude, I was downloading like 2, 3, 400 songs a day, and it was all highly illegal. I didn't even know it was illegal back then. I just sharing music, right? But that was like the crash of the music industry. Like, no, people stopped selling albums after that because you could just get them illegally, right? So back to this corrido thing. In 2006, we have a president by the name of Felipe Calderon who declares war on the drug traffickers. That's a very bad thing to do. Imagine my neighbor next door is a big gangster and I want to go pick a fight with him. Why, right? Doesn't make any sense to do that, right? Especially when you don't have the means to fight against that gangster, especially when the Mexican government is said to have less artillery and less weapons than even some of the major narcs in Mexico, right? So it was a bad idea by the Mexican government, but I think he had to do it for, politics or for whatever reason, right? So 2006, he declares Felipe Calderon, president of Mexico, war on the drug traffickers, and that's when all the big time deaths started happening. In the first like 2 or 3 years of 2006, so by like 2009, there was already like 60, 70,000 homicides related to the drug trade. So what were people singing about in Mexico? We don't like to talk about this issue. It's not in the history books, but what were they singing about? Heads being chopped off, people being tortured, murders, blood, 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 right? And people didn't like that. Um, and those songs were streaming all over YouTube, getting like millions of hits. They were getting shared via Napster and LimeWire and uploading on Apple Music and all this stuff. I remember even in 2009, 2010, Walmart.com on their front page had a music video of Gerardo Ortiz singing an anthem to Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. There was a song that Gerardo Ortiz released in like 2009, I think it was, or 10. And it was an anthem, basically like paying homage to Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. And that song was on Walmart.com. When you click on the Latin music section, right on the front, the video comes out. Sponsored by Caress, the body soap. So that song starts off with an intro of talking, saying, we're giving a shout out to Joaquin Chapo Guzman, the president of Badiraguato, Sinaloa, president of Sinaloa, right? And then the song starts. The song never actually mentions El Chapo, just the very beginning intro talking part. But the video that Walmart uploaded cut that part out and only streamed the song. Does Walmart know? This is a question for you all. Do you think Walmart knows that the song was about El Chapo? Like the biggest drug lord of all time? Lucio says yes. Angel says yes. Why do you think they know? Why do you think that? Lucio, Angel, anybody? Because they're selling it, right? But like specifically, why do they think they know? I always ask this question. You guys are smart. I always ask this question, and most people say, nah, they didn't know. Walmart doesn't know, you know? Of course they know. Exactly, Marla. Capitalism, like, of course they know. If they didn't know, then why did they cut out that beginning part? Right? That's like, here's a very bad example. But let's say I get home to my wife and I have like lipstick right here. I get home and I'm going like this, trying to rub it off. If I'm trying to rub it off, that means I know about it, right? That means I know about it. Just like Walmart, they know about it because they took it off. They took off that intro. And why do they allow it? It's like, how could Walmart allow like this song about El Chapo to be on the front page of their website? Just like Angel said, and Lucio and Marla, they only care about the money. They don't care if they're advertising this type of music. It's money, right? As a fan of that music, I'm gonna click out on Walmart and maybe download the track or buy a couple things because hey, Walmart's doing it. I remember Walmart didn't want to sell corridos. Nobody would. No, you couldn't buy corridos at Walmart, and all of a sudden they're like, we can't sell corridos here. We can't sell albums by this guy or by that guy. We cannot do it. We cannot do it. And then what ended up happening? That becomes one of the most popular musics in the United States and in Mexico. And Walmart says, hey, bring those corridos over here, right? Oh, what about your ethics? What about all that? I remember there's a radio station in LA called La Raza 97.9. When all this violent stuff started happening right in 2006, they decided we are not going to sell corridos. We're not going to put them on our radio station. They had a cero corrido policy. And I was like, that's dumb because there's a lot of beautiful corridos about like Guanajuato and Michoacan and El Caballo Blanco and Durango and Chihuahua, like a lot of beautiful corridos that tell me about the places where I'm from in Mexico. And you're just gonna like because you have a couple corridos that talk about heads chopping off, you're gonna cancel all corridos? That doesn't make sense, right? That doesn't make sense. That's like saying, hey, a Mexican stole a bike from my backyard. I hate all Mexicans, right? I got beat up by a black person. I hate all black people, right? Like it doesn't make sense. You can't generalize in that way. And that's an analogy that I apply to corridos because there are thousands of corridos that exist out there, and a small handful talk about all these bad issues. Well, bad or blood issues, right? So just because there's like a very small percentage, like 2-3% of the corridos that are out there, maybe even less, talk about beheadings, no corridos. All right. And guess what do you think the radio station did? Once corridos started being played at every other station, they try to be innovative by saying zero corridos. They went back, exactly, Lucio. They went back just like that. And I wanted to always like call them up and be like, what's like, you again, just like, I'm not saying Walmart is bad for doing that, but like this radio station, especially, like it rubbed me the wrong way. You can't like, I don't like you. Oh, wait, I like you again. But that's kind of like the history of how like Mexicanos have been treated in our country. 1929, Great Depression, who was that blamed on? Mexicans. They deported us. Like over 1 million people, almost 1 million people got deported. And then what? And then World War II, didn't they support the Trump administration? You know what, Marla? I have no idea about that. I wouldn't be surprised. One of the biggest mariachis in Southern California um supported the Trump administration and a lot of what they stood for, which to me doesn't make sense. Like, dude, half the mariachis in your mariachi aren't even like um legal citizens of the United States, but you support somebody who wants to like deport them or something. Yeah, sometimes it doesn't make sense. I'm assuming you're talking about La Raza 97.9, Marla, but I don't know if they supported the Trump administration. But again, it wouldn't surprise me. There's a lot of people out there who you might assume are not Trump supporters or were not Trump supporters. And then you realize that they were, but you also realize like they make a lot of money. And sometimes it's not even about where you're from or who you are. It's about like, if you think Trump is gonna give you a tax break, then you're gonna support Trump. I know a lot of rich Mexicanos who support Trump, regardless of the good or bad things he says about Mexicans, that doesn't matter to them because they think that he's going to give them a tax break and his policies are going to protect them as rich people, right? So, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. So, all this back to the corridos. Corridos became super violent in 2006. Cut your head off, etc., 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 etc. I'll post a film that I usually, you don't have to watch it, but we usually watch it in my music class. That talks all about that. In 2009, though, 2009, I think record labels got a little bit more smarter, and they said we can't say beheading, we can't say blood, we can't say all that because they won't put us on the radio. So we're just gonna like change the lyrics a little bit, make new corridos that talk about the same issues, but like Gerardo Ortiz's corrido of 2009, we're not gonna mention El Chapo. We're just gonna mention there's this guy who came from nothing, and now he's on top of the game. You know, he technically didn't say nothing about El Chapo, so then technically you can't ban it off of the radio. So there's a huge radio movement in 2009. That's what we call corridos progresivos. There we go, in 2009. And now there's a new wave of corridos, as we mentioned before, that deal with the drug trade, right? Like, and recreational drug use here in the United States. So you have all these, like what they call corridos tumbados. There we go, Lucio. Corridos tumbados and trap corridos. And if you listen to a lot of those, there's like a lot of similarities between like that in terms of like music and like reggae. Reggae is sort of like kickback type of music, right? Reggae is like kickback type of music. Rap is more like aggressive. These are like very general ways of speaking. Rap is sort of like aggressive in your face. Reggae is like, let's kick back, let's smoke or whatever. And the new wave of corridos, like 2006 and 9, was aggressive, like rap in your face, like damn, sounds like rock and roll almost. But this new wave of corridos is kind of like, it has like a little flow to it. It's very hard to explain, but it's kind of like just, I don't know, like almost like chilling music, something you would listen to when you're hanging out, smoking. You know, like the music fits that because reggae was known for that. Let's smoke, let's light it up. It's that slap bass. I don't know if it's that slap bass. I think the slap bass makes it sound nice. I think it's like the rhythm. I think it's the chords they use. Like they use different chords that aren't really found in Mexican music. That's why I say reggae, because reggae uses the same chords as corridos tumbados. Like it's kind of like makes you like mellow out. I don't know. Like it's hard music, but it makes you like sort of like mellow out. I thought corridos would die down by like 2015, 16, like they did during the revolution. They died down right after. 70s, 80s, by the 80s, they were dying down. The 90s, by the early 2000s, they were already dying down. And then this like war on drugs came, they came back, and I figured it's gonna die down. Sooner or later, it's gonna die down. Mm-mm. It's totally wrong about that. Because I've been asked that, hey, when are they gonna die out? I'd be like, I would give it like 2 or 3, 4 more years. By 2020, we're gonna be listening to something totally different. And what happened in 2020? Slap that bass, like Lucio said. Corridos tumbados. In fact, top 10 Billboard chart of Latin music. We've never really had in Latin music, like we've never had a corrido hit the top 10. Um, but this last year, I forgot what artist it was. He had the number, he was a corrido artist, corridos tumbados of this new generation. He had the number 1 song and the number 2 song. That's crazy. We haven't broken top 10, I don't even think we've broken top 20 as corrido artists anywhere. I see we like I'm a corrido artist. No, corrido artists have not broken top 20. And then last year, the guy broke top 20, top 10. I don't think it was Nathaniel Cano. I think it was like Junior H or one of those. It wasn't Nathanael, but the guy had the number 1 hit and the number 2 hit. I've never even heard of this guy either. I looked at the charts and I said, what the heck? My wife says, what kind of crap music is that? And I said, well, who cares? Like, these dudes are doing it. And I went on iTunes and I checked the song. And she's like, damn, he doesn't even know how to sing. I said, who cares? Like look at the guy down the street who sings really good. He's just playing in his garage. This guy's top 1 and 2 of the Billboard chart. The first 2 spots. That's crazy. That goes to show you how mainstream these corridos are. Back then, you play corridos in this 1910, 1970s, 1990s, or 2006. You have to wear a cowboy hat and dress up and all that. Nowadays, the dudes are wearing like baseball hats. They're wearing Laker jerseys. Like they look exactly like you, right? And that's why a lot of kids are into them. Because before you could not relate to it. You could not relate to corridos because they were old men and mustaches and a big gut and a big cowboy hat singing corridos from a place that you don't even know in Mexico. Now it's the kid from the backyard. It's the kid across the street. And even though he lives in an apartment down the street, this guy has like 2.5 million followers on Instagram or something. And it's crazy. So what's the future of corridos? I have no idea. Maybe you could ask me, but I never thought corridos tumbados would ever become a thing, right? It's very like in my opinion, it's very unpredictable. But it always reflects what's happening in society, right? Things happen in society and people sing about it. I should have known when we were like talking about should we or should we not legalize drugs 10 years ago that the new songs were going to be not about drug trading, but about like drug usage, right? Like hanging out, chilling, doing drugs. All right. Do you guys have any questions on that? I kind of went through the entire PowerPoint and the next one just with this one slide 7 of when the corrido was popular. I think this is the most important slide out of both of them, right? So I don't have to go through all the slides. We just stuck on this one. So let me stop sharing. Anybody have any questions for me? Anybody want to write them in the chat or ask out loud about corridos or anything? See, no, yes, no, maybe. All right, let me stop recording.